There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard or sleeping too little. It's the exhaustion that settles into your bones after you've spent an hour or a day or a year trying to make someone understand you who has already decided they don't want to. It's the fatigue of over-explanation, and if you've ever felt it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That hollow, drained feeling after you've laid out your reasoning, your intentions, your heart, piece by piece, only to watch the other person either dismiss it, twist it, or simply look at you with the same cold eyes they had before you started talking. Nothing changed, and yet you kept going. You kept explaining. Why? That's the question we're going to sit with today. Because over-explaining yourself to people who already dislike you is not just a communication habit. It's a psychological trap, a deeply human one, and understanding why we fall into it is the first step toward finally getting free. Let's start at the beginning. When you were a child, explanation worked. If your parent was upset with you, you could explain what happened and often the tension would dissolve. If a teacher thought you hadn't done your homework, you could explain the situation and be believed. Explanation, in those early environments, was a tool of repair. It restored connection. It reversed misunderstanding. It worked. And so your nervous system learned. When someone is displeased with me, when there is tension between us, when I feel the cold air of disapproval, I explain, I justify, I clarify. I make them understand, because understanding leads to acceptance. That was the lesson. That was the programming. But here's where things get complicated. As you grew up, you started encountering people for whom that rule no longer applied. People who weren't simply misunderstanding you. People who had already formed a conclusion about you and were not, in any real sense, looking for more information. And still, that old programming kicked in. The discomfort of being disliked, of being misread, of being judged, it triggered the old response. Explain, justify, clarify, make them understand. And so you talked, and they didn't change. And you talked more, and they still didn't change. And somewhere in that loop, you started to believe that the problem was your explanation, that it wasn't clear enough, detailed enough, articulate enough. So you tried harder. You found better words. You brought in context. You laid out timelines. You addressed every possible counterargument in advance. You became a lawyer arguing your own case before a jury that had already signed the verdict. This is the trap. And it's important to name it clearly. Over-explaining yourself to people who dislike you is not a communication failure. It's an emotional response to a perceived threat, the threat of rejection, the threat of being misunderstood permanently, the threat of someone carrying a false version of you in their mind, and that threat feels genuinely dangerous, especially if you grew up in an environment where being misunderstood had real consequences, where the disapproval of a parent meant emotional withdrawal, where being misread by a sibling meant conflict that lasted for days, where social rejection felt life-threatening in the way it only can when you're young and your world is small. For many people, over-explaining is a trauma response. Not dramatic trauma necessarily, but the quiet, accumulated kind, the kind that comes from years of needing to defend yourself, justify yourself, prove yourself to people who held power over you. And if that's your history, then your impulse to over-explain isn't weakness. It's a very logical adaptation to a difficult environment. The problem is that you've carried that adaptation into contexts where it no longer serves you. Let's talk about what actually happens neurologically when we feel disliked or criticized. The brain, specifically the amygdala, treats social rejection as a form of danger. Studies in social neuroscience have consistently shown that the pain of social exclusion activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. This isn't metaphorical. Being disliked genuinely registers as a threat to your safety. And when your brain perceives a threat, it wants to neutralize it. Fight, flee, or, and this is the one we don't talk about enough, appease. Over-explaining is a form of appeasement behavior. It's your nervous system trying to neutralize a social threat by flooding the other person with information until they relent. But here's the brutal truth about appeasement when it comes to people who dislike you. It rarely works, and it often backfires. When you over-explain to someone who already holds a negative view of you, you're not giving them more information. You're giving them more material, more words to misinterpret, more intentions to question, more sentences to take out of context. The person who is determined to misunderstand you will find a way to misunderstand your explanation too. And worse, your eagerness to explain can actually confirm their negative narrative about you. Look how defensive they are. Look how much they need to justify themselves. Clearly they have something to hide. The very act of over-explaining can become evidence against you in a court you were never going to win. There's also something important to understand about the psychology of dislike. When someone has formed a dislike for you, that feeling isn't primarily rational. It didn't emerge purely from a careful analysis of your actions and character. It emerged from a complex web of their own experiences, their own wounds, their own projections, their own needs, their insecurities, their comparisons, their history with people who reminded them of you. In many cases, you are a screen onto which they are projecting something that has very little to do with who you actually are. And you cannot explain your way out of someone else's projection. You simply can't, because the projection isn't about information. It's about emotion. It's about what they need to believe, or fear, or protect themselves from. This is one of the hardest things to accept, because we want to believe that if we just say it right, if we just find the perfect combination of words, we can reach someone. We can make them see us clearly. We can dissolve the misunderstanding. And sometimes, yes, with people who are genuinely open and simply confused, that works. But with people who are invested in their dislike, people who need you to be the villain of their story, or who are deeply threatened by something you represent, or who have tied their identity to a particular view of you, explanation doesn't touch them. You're not speaking to their reason. Their reason has already been recruited to serve their emotion. Now let's talk about the cost. Because we've been talking about why it doesn't work, but I want to spend some time on what it actually costs you when you fall into this trap. The first cost is your energy. Every time you over-explain, you're withdrawing from an emotional account. You're spending mental and emotional resources, focus, clarity, emotional bandwidth on a transaction that returns nothing. And that energy is finite. It could have gone into your work, your relationships with people who do see you, your creative projects, your rest, your growth. Instead, it went into a conversation that left you more depleted than before. The second cost is your self-trust. Here's something that doesn't get discussed enough. Every time you launch into a long explanation to someone who doesn't respect you, you send yourself a message. The message is, their opinion of me matters so much that I need to restructure my inner world around changing it. And when you operate from that message repeatedly, you start to lose touch with your own knowing. You start to question yourself, not because you've received genuinely useful feedback, but because the discomfort of being disliked has become so intolerable that you're willing to entertain any narrative that might make it stop, including the one that says you're the problem. The third cost is your dignity. There's a version of explanation that is honest and open and human. And then there's the over-explanation that crosses into pleading, that frantic, desperate quality of needing someone to understand, to agree, to relent. People around you can sense that quality. And while it might generate some sympathy in observers, it also signals something, that you don't fully believe in your own right to exist as you are without their approval. And that signal, once sent, is hard to take back. The fourth cost, and perhaps the most insidious, is that it keeps you entangled. Every over-explanation extends the relationship. It gives the other person more access to you. It keeps you in their orbit. And often, the healthiest thing you can do with someone who dislikes you, particularly someone who is not in a position of authority over you, not someone you have to navigate daily, is simply to reduce the entanglement. To let the relationship find its natural level, which may be very distant or even non-existent. But you can't do that while you're still trying to win them over. Over-explanation is a form of staying, of refusing to accept that this particular relationship is not going to be what you want it to be. So why do we keep doing it? We've talked about the programming, the neurological threat response, the childhood learning, but there's something else too. There's a particular story we tell ourselves in those moments. The story goes something like this. If I don't explain myself, they will continue to believe something false about me. And if they believe something false about me, that false thing will somehow become real. As if their mistaken belief has power over your actual identity. As if not correcting the record means the false record is true. This is the magical thinking at the heart of over-explanation. The belief that you must manage the narratives people hold about you, or those narratives will corrupt reality itself. But here's the thing. Your identity is not stored in other people's perceptions of you. It exists independently of what any individual thinks. Someone can believe something completely false about you and your actual character, your actual intentions, your actual worth. None of that changes. A lie told about you doesn't become your truth. And a dislike formed about you doesn't become your definition. There's a useful distinction here between people whose opinions genuinely matter and people whose opinions you've mistakenly elevated. The opinions that genuinely matter are those of people who know you well, who engage with you in good faith, who have earned the kind of intimacy and trust that makes their perception of you meaningful. When those people raise a concern, when they reflect something back to you that's worth sitting with, that's worth some genuine reflection and, yes, sometimes explanation. But even then, the best explanation is a conversation, not a monologue. It's a dialogue in which you're open to hearing as well as speaking. The opinions of people who dislike you, who don't know you well, who engage with you in bad faith, who have already decided what they think. These opinions feel urgent and weighty, but they are not. Their emotional charge comes from your nervous system's threat response, not from their actual relevance to your life. Learning to distinguish between these two categories, genuinely meaningful feedback versus emotionally charged noise, is one of the most important skills you can develop. Let me talk now about a particular version of this trap that is especially common and especially painful. It's the trap of over-explaining to family members who have cast you in a particular role. In family systems, roles get assigned early and they calcify. You might be the difficult one, the dramatic one, the selfish one, the failure, the rebel. And if you've been cast in one of these roles, you know that no amount of explanation shifts it. You can show up having achieved something remarkable and someone will find a way to frame it within the existing narrative. You can explain your choices with perfect clarity and watch your words get filtered through the lens of who they've decided you are. Family dynamics are some of the most powerful forces in human psychology, and trying to explain yourself out of a family role you've been assigned is often an exercise in profound futility. This doesn't mean you give up on family relationships, but it does mean you might need to release the goal of being understood by everyone in your family. Some people in your family may simply not be able to see you clearly, not because you're impossible to understand, but because they need the version of you they've constructed. It serves something in them, their own identity, their own story about the family, their own management of their own pain, and your explanations, no matter how true and careful, cannot undo that need. The same dynamic plays out in workplaces. If a manager has decided they don't like you or don't believe in you, if a colleague has built a narrative about your competence or your character, over-explaining to that person is usually not the path forward. The path forward is often lateral, finding other people in the organization who do see your value, building your reputation through your work rather than your words, and sometimes making the hard assessment that this environment is not going to change and it's time to seek one that will. Now I want to address something that might be coming up for you as you listen to this. You might be thinking, but isn't it important to stand up for yourself? Isn't it important to correct the record when someone is saying something false? Isn't silence a form of acceptance? These are fair questions and they deserve a careful answer. Yes, there are absolutely situations where you should speak up, where silence would be harmful to yourself, to your reputation, to your safety. If someone is spreading demonstrably false information that is affecting your professional life, your relationships, your standing in a community, you may well need to address that directly, through appropriate channels, in ways that are clear and strategic. That's different from what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the compulsive, emotionally driven over-explaining that happens not because it's strategically necessary, but because the discomfort of being disliked is so intolerable that you can't stop yourself from trying to fix it. The question to ask yourself in those moments is, am I explaining because this will genuinely change something important, or am I explaining because I cannot tolerate this person's discomfort with me? The first is sometimes a good reason to speak. The second is the trap. There's also a version of this that masquerades as honesty and vulnerability. We live in a culture that values openness and sharing, and sometimes over-explainers tell themselves that what they're doing is just being honest, just being vulnerable, just being real. But there's a difference between genuine vulnerability, which is offered in the context of safety and mutual respect, and the kind of oversharing and over-justifying that happens when you're trying to force connection with someone who isn't available for it. Real vulnerability requires a safe container. Pouring yourself out to someone who disrespects you isn't vulnerability. It's exposure without protection, and it tends not to create connection. It tends to create the opposite. So what do you do instead? What does it look like to release this pattern? The first thing, and this is foundational, is to practice tolerating the discomfort of being misunderstood, because that's really what's at the root of this. The over-explanation is an attempt to escape the discomfort of having someone hold a wrong or negative image of you. And the only way to stop over-explaining is to become willing to sit with that discomfort without acting on it, to feel the urge to explain and to breathe through it, to remind yourself, this person's view of me is not my truth. I can allow them to think what they think. I do not have to fix this. This is genuinely hard. I want to name that clearly. For people who grew up with insecure attachment, for people who learned that they were not safe unless they were approved of, this practice of tolerating the discomfort of disapproval can feel almost impossible at first. It can activate grief, rage, anxiety. That's normal. It means you're getting close to something real. And it may be worth exploring with a therapist, because the roots of this pattern often go deep, and the untangling of them deserves proper support and care. The second thing is to invest your explanatory energy where it has a return. Find the people in your life and they exist. even if they feel rare, who engage with you in good faith, who want to understand you, who will receive your honesty and your nuance and your complexity with genuine interest. Invest there. Give your best words, your most honest reflections, your deepest explanations to the people who will actually do something meaningful with them. Don't hoard yourself for people who won't value what you offer. The third thing is to develop what I'd call a clear-eyed acceptance of relational limits. Not every relationship is going to be what you want it to be. Some people are not going to like you. Some people are not going to understand you. Some people have decided who you are and are not available to revision. That's a reality of human life. And the sooner you accept it without making it mean something catastrophic about your worth, the freer you become. The relationship between being liked and being worthy is one we absorbed early, and it runs deep, but it is not true. You can be profoundly worthy and have people who dislike you. These two things coexist in the lives of every human being who has ever lived. The fourth thing is to notice the physical sensation of the urge to over-explain. It usually has a quality to it, a kind of urgency in the chest, a tightening in the throat, a rushing sensation, a need to fill silence. When you notice that sensation, you don't have to follow it. You can pause. You can ask yourself, what am I actually afraid of right now? What do I think will happen if I don't explain? Often the fear, when you name it, loses some of its power. You realize it's an old fear. A fear that was formed in a different context, with different people, in different conditions that no longer apply. And fifth, and this is perhaps the most important, build your relationship with yourself to the point where you are your own primary witness. By this I mean, you know what you intended. You know what happened. You know your own character, your own history, your own effort. You are not dependent on someone else's acknowledgement of those things for them to be real. Your good intentions are real whether or not anyone recognizes them. Your effort is real whether or not anyone credits it. Your growth is real whether or not anyone sees it. When you are anchored in your own witness, when you have developed a genuine, honest, compassionate relationship with your own experience, the need to convince others shrinks considerably, not because you've become arrogant or closed, but because you no longer need their validation to confirm what you already know. This is the work, and it's not quick work. It's not the kind of thing that shifts after one conversation with yourself or one podcast or one therapy session. It's the slow, patient work of building a self that doesn't collapse under the weight of someone else's dislike. A self that can say, with genuine equanimity, you may think what you think about me, and I will continue to be who I am. Not defensively, not dismissively, but with a quiet, rooted certainty. There's a kind of freedom that lives on the other side of this work. A freedom that's hard to describe until you've tasted it. It's the freedom of walking into a room without needing everyone in it to approve of you. The freedom of having a difficult conversation without needing it to end with the other person agreeing that you were right. The freedom of being misunderstood and not having it derail your entire day. The freedom of letting people be wrong about you without it becoming your emergency. People who have done this work carry something different about them. There's a settledness, a groundedness, a quality of not needing to prove anything. And paradoxically, not that this should be the motivation, but it's worth noting this quality tends to attract more genuine connection than all the explaining in the world ever did. Because people are drawn to those who are rooted in themselves. Not people who are rigid or closed, but people who are genuinely at home in who they are. That kind of person doesn't need to convince you of anything. They simply are who they are, and that clarity is magnetic. You are allowed to be someone that not everyone likes. You are allowed to be misunderstood. You are allowed to exist without having managed every person's perception of you into perfect alignment with your intentions. You are not responsible for other people's ability or willingness to see you clearly. You are responsible only for being honest, for doing your best, for treating people with basic respect, and then releasing what you cannot control. The next time you feel that familiar urgency rising, that need to explain yourself to someone who has already decided what they think, see if you can pause. Just for a moment, and ask yourself, who am I really trying to convince right now? Is it them? Or is it some younger, more frightened version of yourself that still believes that if you could just explain it well enough, you would finally be safe? And then maybe, gently, you can say something to that younger self. You can say, I see you. I know why you learned to explain. I know why you thought you had to, but you are safe now. You don't have to earn your place here. You don't have to make everyone understand. You are allowed to be known imperfectly, and you are still entirely whole. That's the invitation. That's the work. And it's worth it, not because it will make everyone like you, but because it will finally allow you to like yourself, unconditionally, without needing anyone else to sign off on it first.